It is very rarely that you come to Mount St Bernard Abbey in Charley and find the car park empty and the place deserted. Many visitors appreciate the tranquility, the sense of peace, of a calm, orderly life, and many come just to sit and admire the meticulously maintained grounds. But walk a little way from the abbey to a corner of the monastery land, and a visitor new to the area might wonder why the old brick shed has been left standing right in the middle of a field. It's something of a blot on the landscape. Most local people nowadays pass it without really seeing it. It fades into the landscape and seems to serve no useful purpose. In 1981, the shed came close to being demolished. The new residents of St Joseph's thought it really was a blot on the landscape and asked the monks if they could knock it down. "You won't knock that down in a hurry," they were told. "It's solid." So they planted Russian vine to disguise it and used the bigger bay for their bonfires. They hadn't been living at St Joseph's for long when they got talking to a man walking along the road. He told them that he had been in their house during the war. He was working in the field next door, where that brick thing is, and he used to come into the house through the front door and into a room through a door on the left. This was significant and verified his story. There had been a door there at one time. It had been discovered during the 1970s renovations to the house. The story he told was quite vague, apart from these specific details about the interior of the house. He said that the brick structure was for use by the RAF, but, sadly, he was never asked about his involvement, and 30 years later, who he was and the details of the conversation have been forgotten. But some spark of curiosity about the wartime use of the house had been ignited, and a letter went off to the RAF archives asking about their use of the house called St Joseph's. The answer soon came back: no record. Over the years there were various conversations about the structure, speculation about its function, tales of it being used as a wartime rifle range for shooting practice, but nothing emerged to grab the attention. Until one evening at the Oaks in Charnwood Garden Club supper, a man was pointed out. He knows about the brick building in St Joseph's Field. And Ken Nichols enters the story with an amazing tale to tell. His first revelation was that the site was used by the RAF 80 Wing for what was classified as top secret work, and he had been an airman in that wing and stationed in St Joseph's Field during 1942 and 1943. A meeting was arranged between Ken and John and Maureen Havers. They were the couple who had moved to St Joseph's in 1981, and they were keen to discuss the history of the 100-year-old house. Ken began to talk about the reasons for a signal station in such a remote place as Charley, 15 miles from Leicester, and the same roughly from Derby and Nottingham. He talked about German radio beams which directed the pilots to crucial targets in Britain, about the British discovery of these beams and the counter-activities of RAF 80 Wing. He produced a diagram to explain the technology behind the story, and while his listeners found it fascinating, it was really beyond their experience. And the diagram and the notes were filed away and subsequently forgotten in the pursuit of the history of the house. It was some years later that one of the monks at the abbey found a handwritten exercise book.
Oh, I got the book in 1942. Great, come on, quick.
With the title, The Chronicles of Mount St Bernard Abbey. And he turned to an entry dated the 7th of February 1942. Again, this was interesting to the Havers, but they weren't to be deflected from the history of St Joseph's. However, on a visit to the Public Record Office at Kew for other research, Maureen had a quick look at the RAF records and found a record of a Colville outstation housing aspirin, bromide and benjamin, information which was again filed away in case it ever became useful. And the 20th century closed. The beambender's voice had not yet been heard. By now, all sorts of bits and pieces had been amassed about the beambender, but as yet there was no hint of a coherent story. But, to celebrate the millennium, Charley Heritage Group was formed, and the group quickly established that the little place called Charley had many tales to tell. One important task agreed on was to collect the experiences of residents during World War II, and interviews were recorded and archived. One such was a story told by Les Cook of Drybrook Farm, who had a first-hand account of a fatal crash.
There was two Canadians in two tiger moths, and they were practicing bombing on the reservoir, and one got in the reservoir, and he got drowned.
Sometime later, 2 new members joined the group with a specific interest in the war years. It was time to get all the material together and see what could be made of it. Mike Froggatt found a book about A.V. Jones, who had masterminded the counterattack of the German directional beams, and Mike gave a talk to the group about the National Beambender Defence System. Terry Shepherd met Ken Nichols and talked at length to him, and he was able to reconstruct the layout of St. Joseph's Field during the war years from Ken's clear memories. Within a short space of time, Terry had the draft of a book in front of the group, World War II in Charley, and all the collected archival material was there, not only the beambender account, but how the people of Charley had experienced the war. In 2011, the nation's media revisited the time of the Battle of Britain, and the BBC's early evening programme, The One Show, ran a series of films about aspects of the war. Ken stood in the field where he had worked 70 years earlier and recounted his story to Joe Crawley. After the film was shown on The One Show, the presenter of the day, Chris Evans, commented that it was the best film in their wartime series. Whether this was because of the uniqueness of the story or Ken's performance, I'll leave you to judge. Ken's reminiscences with Terry had included memories of happier times in his service in Charley.
You were, the BBC came and fetched you and took you down to the field.
Yes.
And stuck you on your feet for rather a long time, I think.
Yeah. Yes.
What did that feel like to do that?
Well, nostalgic in a sense, you know, that to think, because it wasn't, as far as I was concerned, it wasn't just the RAF and the fact that I'd been there serving. It was the fact that it was related to my wife.
Why?
You know, that was
Yeah.
the two factors combined.
So being back in the field brought you back in touch with those
Yes.
times when you first met your wife.
Yes.
Can you tell us again about that meeting your wife?
Yeah, well, there's a gate at the side which is on the Oaks Road itself, which we used to use as an entrance to the site. And there was a cherry tree at the side, which is indicated on the map, and he used to have some wonderful cherries there. And I was there with a friend of mine, and we were just leaning over the gate having a cup of tea, tell you the truth, or a mug of tea. I remember the mug now, it had got Ken on it, painted. Yeah, and these two young ladies came up the hill from the direction of Shepshed, wheeling the bikes, you see, because it was quite a steep climb there. And we got in conversation with them, and we had a chat, and much to my surprise, because I'd be 19 at the time, and I hadn't had much contact with girls. I plucked up courage and asked her whether she'd like to go to a dance, which was being organised by the RAF actually in Colville at the Baths. So that's how it all started.
Now, that night, after that dance, and you were back in your digs, what were you thinking as you were falling asleep?
Oh, I don't know. Oh, dear me, it's a long, long time ago, that is. I know I was quite happy. I was quite happy and content.
With the success of Ken's TV appearance and the first print run of the book being sold out, it was felt that more stories might be forthcoming if people's memories were jogged by actually standing on the site. And so it was decided to open the field for the National Heritage Open Day in September 2012. And after a few reservations about the amount of work involved, the group agreed. Encouraged, shall I say, by Terry, Mike and Richard. With Ken's help, Terry had made a plan of St Joseph's Field as it was in the time of RAF 80 Wing, and he proposed that the layout be reconstructed. But first, the blast shelter was almost inaccessible, covered in Russian vine, surrounded by nettles and filled with stones and debris. Father Joseph, the abbot of Mount St Bernard, was happy for the work to go ahead and the September Open Day staged, so the site had to be cleared. The task was begun with great enthusiasm, until it was realised just how much the mile-a-minute shrub can grow in 30 years. It was time to call in friends with power, and it became a quite enjoyable spectacle. With the pleasure of bonfires afterwards. Some weeks later, the rubble from the shelter had been cleared, and it was time to think about the planned event for the National Heritage Open Day in September. 2012 had been one of the wettest years on record, and there was some trepidation about the safety of visitors in a muddy, slippery field, and the possibility of no one venturing out if it was another wet and windy day. But dawn broke on September the 8th, 2012, with sunshine and the promise of a very fine day. All the preparations were in place. It was time to go. The cadets of the Colville Air Training Corps, with their commander, set up their camouflage tent, radio transmitters and map stations. They were totally involved in the day, from greeting visitors on their arrival with a smart salute, sending and receiving radio message on their walkie-talkies, making paper aeroplanes, and showing us the survival food packs used on training exercises, but also in combat zones. Some months earlier, Richard Froggatt had acquired a Rubery Owen 2-ton communications trailer, similar to what would have been in use in 1942, and it was driven into the Beambender Bay, equipped with radio sets, and had a constant stream of interested people all day. The story of the RAF 80 Signals Wing and its part in deflecting German radio beams was graphically told in the exhibition tent, and for the technically minded, the technology was explained clearly and precisely. Mike Froggatt, a hoarder, produced enough 1940s artefacts to start a museum, but which also had visitors constantly exclaiming, "We had one like that." It was a great day. The Charley Beambender story is now well and truly out in the open, and all the myths dispelled. Thanks to Ken Nichols. Thank you, Ken.